1939, the great Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, known as the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto, also known as the Piazetzner Rebbe, with thousands of Hasidim, thousands of devotees, thousands of students. His pedagogy and his prolific writing on the inner life, not only of adults, but also of children, was well known. 1939, the Rebbe, when the Nazis assaulted Warsaw in the aerial bombing, lost his son-in-law and his only daughter, his son rather, and his daughter-in-law. And after the invasion, the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto, the Piazetzner, ran a secret synagogue in the ghetto. He invested enormous efforts in maintaining Jewish life in the ghetto, even after his horrific personal loss. And he was able to survive the ghetto liquidation, avoiding most of the tragic deportations to Treblinka. But eventually, of course, he made his way and was taken to the Troniki work camp near Lublin after the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was crushed. Although he was offered an opportunity to leave, to escape from the concentration camp, he refused. And he was killed on November 3rd, 1943. The Piazetzner Rebbe, in that year, 1939, when he lost his son, his beloved son, and his daughter-in-law, penned these words on that Rosh Hashanah. He wrote to his Hasidim in a work that I might not have mentioned, a work that he wrote, the only extant writings and sermons that were given in the Warsaw Ghetto that he wrote and were put into a milk crate and were discovered after the war by a construction worker. That became the book Eish Kodesh, the Holy Fire. He wrote in 1939 on Rosh Hashanah. He writes, Kiviti Adonai kivta nafshi. Quoting from the Psalm in Psalm 27, where the psalmist says, God, I hope in you. Tikvatihi, I have a hope, he says, that all of Israel will be redeemed. I have a hope. And he writes that what gives him hope is the recognition that we have a tradition, a framing for calamity. We have within the Jewish tradition a way to make sense of that which should not make any sense. The Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto, the Piazetzner, looking out at all of his devotees, said, we have a tradition that says that when God created the world, God, like any great artist, made many attempts before finally arriving at this one. God was building worlds and then destroying them. And then eventually there was this world. He says, so I know that the way that our tradition looks at the world is not that there is a world that then is destroyed, but there is a world that comes after destruction. That after this, the Rebbe writes, after this I know another world will be born. How do we make sense of a world that is eroding before our eyes, a world that is collapsing, a world that ceases to make sense to us, a world where the concepts that we have are being reworked in the present moment. The concepts with which we make sense of the world are being themselves deconstructed and reconstructed before our very eyes. The Rebbe didn't have to look to the cosmology of the Jewish people. He didn't have to look to the notion found in early rabbinic literature that the world was being destroyed and then reborn, destroyed and then reborn. He could very easily have looked to the Talmud, where the Talmud teaches us that in the first century of the Common Era, in 70 of the Common Era, that when the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem and destroyed our sacred center, that there were many different factions, many different sects that were vying for the Jewish future, for the future of the world that the Jews lived in. Some thought that they would run away and fight. Some thought that better to die on Mount Masada than it was to give in to the Romans. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the great Yochanan ben Zakkai, was brought out in a coffin to Vespasian, to the general, to the ruler of the Romans. And he asked, give me Yavne, give me the town of Yavda and its scholars. Give me the tools to build the future. Give me the tools, give me the people who have the adaptive capacities to imagine a future, to take what we have and use it to build what we don't yet know. The power of Yochanan ben Zakkai's deal with Vespasian is what allows us to stand here today in rabbinic Jewish riches, with the wealth of our tradition and its wisdom and its practices, so that we might say today, I'm a Jew because of Yochanan ben Zakkai. I'm a Jew because of the one who imagined a day after this and adapted to that reality. But maybe the Piazetzner in 1939 wasn't just thinking about the Talmud. He wasn't thinking about worlds that were destroyed. He wasn't thinking about either of those stories. Maybe the Rebbe was drawing on something else. Maybe the Rebbe was drawing upon the earliest story in the Torah itself of destruction and its aftermath. Maybe the after this of Beverly Pincus's beautiful poem this morning begins with the after flood. The Torah describes in the early chapters of our mythic history of a great deluge, a great flood. And Noach, the hero of the story, is told by God to come into the ark and save the seeds of what would become potentially a future, but wasn't told how long. Wasn't told how long the deluge would last. He wasn't told what to look for or the signs. And Noah sends out some birds, sends out an orev, a crow, and then finally he sends out a yonah, a dove. V'lo matza yonah manoach lechaf ragla. And the dove didn't find a place to rest. So Noah sent it again until finally the dove rested on solid ground, and Noah knew it was time. And then God's voice came to Noah and said, Say minat teva, it's time to leave your enclosure. It's time to be able to go out again into the world. And remarkably, of course, Noah and his family, they leave. And then the story goes that Noah and his family are worried, of course, about what would happen. Is it possible to imagine that this will come again? And God says in the Torah, we're told in our sacred tradition, that God says, I will place a covenant, briti natati banan. I will place my covenant, my sign for all of you in the cloud above. I'll place a kashat, a rainbow. I'll place a rainbow in the clouds above that will let you know that the rainbow will signify the power of life after this. Life after this. Remember reading a couple of years ago a book by Jonathan Lear, the great Harvard philosopher, who wrote a book called Radical Hope Ethics in a Time of Cultural Devastation. And Jonathan Lear writes in a book which is rooted in the story of one great chief of a great nation of the Native Americans, the indigenous original peoples, whose name was Plenty Coups. And in telling the story, when he was reading through the interviews that were made between Plenty Coups and the white man, when Plenty Coups was giving over his narrative, was telling his people's history to a historian who was writing it down, he comes to a point in his narrative where Plenty Coups, describing the loss of buffalo, the loss of the cultural constructions that made sense for the Crow people, he says, and after that, nothing happened. After that, nothing happened. And Lear wonders to himself as he's reading this tale, he wonders, what could that possibly mean, that nothing happened after the buffalo went away? Did it mean literally that nothing happened? Was this great chief saying that the sun didn't rise or set, or that human experience no longer contributed to events? Were there no events? He didn't know how to understand these words. Was it just a figure of speech? Nothing happened of significance? What could he possibly have meant? Après, after this, nothing happened. And Lear goes on to describe what courage might mean and what hope might mean, and gives a very simple definition. He writes that hope is living in the vulnerability that we share as humans who are limited and don't know. Hope is living in the vulnerability that we share as humans who don't know. To be born into this world is to be born not omnipotent and not omniscient. To be born into this world, writes Lear, using Plato's notion of eros, an erotic being, a being who yearns, comes into the world with lack, with a sense of limitation, of not knowing. And we reach out instinctively as infants, assuming, although we have no reason to believe this, but assuming that our need will be met, our yearning will be assuaged, that something in us reaches for nourishment. We are born with a great vulnerability, writes Lear, and hope is born. Hope is born amongst those who are willing to risk yearning for what is yet unknown, what is yet to be discovered, what is yet available. In this morning's Kriyat Torah, as we read this morning, I don't know if you've ever noticed this before, but it hit me so powerfully this year when I was thinking about the rainbow of Noah and the rainbow and the promise of the rainbow. In this morning's Kriyat Torah and the reading about the story of Isaac and Ishmael, as we make the turn to the hopelessness of Hagar as she imagines her son Ishmael in danger in the desert without any water, she places him at a distance of a bow. And in Hebrew, the word bow is kashat, keshet, like the shape of the rainbow. She places him somewhere beyond the bow, somewhere beyond the rainbow. Somewhere beyond that rainbow, she hoped and prayed that that which she couldn't yet know would be revealed. for the concepts and the structures that have been eroding, but now we don't know what will replace it, what will be after this pandemic, what will be after this. But we hope and we pray and we yearn and we are vulnerable and we are risk takers and we say, somewhere over that rainbow, over there. Now, I know maybe some of you are thinking, well, what about that somewhere over the rainbow? That other Wizard of Oz, that other Wizard of Strength. But lest you think that that's somewhere over the rainbow, you've heard it before, you've sung it many times. But that poignant song that emerged out of the mass exodus from Europe, that remarkable song was written by a Jew named Yip Harburg. The lyrics of that song came from the youngest of 4 children born to a Russian Jewish immigrant family. His real name was Isidor Hochberg. He grew up in a Yiddish-speaking Orthodox home in New York. And that somewhere over the rainbow music that we're so familiar with, was written by Harold Arlen, a cantor's son. His real name was Hyman Arluk. Harburg and Arluk. Jewish immigrants from Lithuania. And they wrote that song, which was, of course, voted the #1 song by the Recording Industry Association and the National Endowment for the Arts. That song became the #1 song of 20th century America. And in writing that song, they reached deep into their Jewish roots, into their Jewish mythos. And they wrote an unforgettable melody with prophetic words. If you read those lyrics in their Jewish context, the words are no longer about wizards and about some story of Oz, but about Jewish survival, about human hope. These words were written in 1939, at the same time that the Rebbe from the Piazetzner, the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto, wrote his words. So listen to these words. Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, there's a land that I heard of once in a lullaby. Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are blue, and the dreams that you dare to dream, they come true. If you wish upon a star and you wake up where the clouds are behind you, where troubles melt like lemon drops way above the chimney tops, that's where you'll find me. Somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly. Birds fly over the rainbow. Why, oh, why can't I? We are ever born. This Jewish family and this human family, like the phoenix that rises from the ashes. We are a people of the rainbow. We are a people of hope. Our strength is to forever long for that, to take the risk that is involved in birthing hope. Believing in and taking those risks for the sake of our souls. May our ancestors and all of those who have come before us bless us with the hope that emerges from somewhere over the rainbow.